Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the OIS podcast. I'm Sophia Pathai, MD, PhD, and I'll be your host for today. Now, I'm thrilled that over the last year, we've had the chance to speak to some great entrepreneurs, early stage companies, and even the late stage folks in the ophthalmology space. It's been very US and Europe focused. So I'm really happy today that we take a leap, maybe more eastwards, and we get to learn more about AffaMed Therapeutics. And importantly, we get a chance to speak to their Chief Financial Officer, Vijay Karwal. Vijay, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Sophia. Thank you for having me.
We're thrilled to have you. For those folks who don't know about AffaMed Therapeutics, it's a clinical stage biopharma company that's focused on developing and commercializing pharma, digital, and surgical products that address critical unmet need in ophthalmology, neurology, and psychiatric disorders. And Vijay is, of course, the CFO, but also an operating partner of CBC Group. Now, Vijay, we, of course, want to learn more about AffaMed, its history and its future. But to start with, tell us something about your career journey to date. I know you've had quite the global career, and maybe, if memory serves me well, even time in the UK. So would love to learn more.
Thank you so much. Yes, I guess I have a background that's perhaps a little bit more international than most. I'm a native of the Netherlands. I'm Dutch, although as my name suggests, I'm obviously of Indian heritage. I was born and raised there, educated in Holland, but also for a brief period in the UK, in Southampton. And after graduating in finance and economics, so I have no background in, frankly, healthcare or science in that regard, although I've picked up a fair amount over the years. I actually started my career in international banking and was fortunate to have an opportunity to live and work and learn in a number of different geographies. I spent roughly the first half of my career, the first dozen years in the United States, principally in New York, where I worked as a healthcare banker. I did spend a number of years in London as well, working in the European capital markets. And then a little over a dozen years ago, I came to Asia and have worked principally in Hong Kong, but also in Singapore over the past 10 plus years, mainly in finance, but having always been specialized in healthcare. It came to a point where the temptation to, become, a principal instead of an advisor, became too great, and had an opportunity to make a move across to, what from my previous perception would have been the other side of the table, a little over a year ago by joining AffaMed as their CFO.
Well, thank you for sharing that marvelous journey. And, one of my favorite parts about doing these podcasts is that folks have such diverse, non-linear journeys before they ultimately somehow end up in ophthalmology. So we're thrilled to have you in the ophthalmology space as well. And that brings me to AffaMed. So, folks across in the US and Europe may well have heard of AffaMed, but just bring us up to speed. Tell us more about the company through its inception and its journey. And also, I know that we mentioned ophthalmology, but you have a broader pipeline in neurology and psychiatry. So talk to us a bit more about AffaMed.
Yeah, so I think AffaMed has to be understood within the context of the evolution of the life sciences and particularly biotech ecosystem in Greater China as a whole over the past couple of years. And I think the company was established to capture really two principal opportunities that have arisen. One is to bridge the gap between global innovation and unmet need in China. I think many of the listeners and viewers might be aware that the vast majority of new products, molecules, devices that have been developed and approved for the North American and European markets never actually were brought to market to China. And a combination of regulatory reform, reimbursement reform, and other factors have significantly changed the pathways over the past couple of years, and have opened up an opportunity really to bridge that gap and to an extent perform a degree of catch-up by identifying important innovation that is not yet available to Chinese patients And AffaMed is very consciously looking to identify, products and devices that can be used in that regard. I think the second key area that we're looking to benefit from is in a way the reverse of that, which is that China and Asia as a whole are also starting to play a much bigger role in innovation themselves. And whereas that in the beginning might have been viewed more as perhaps me betters or fast followers, we're starting to see dynamics now where true innovation is starting to come out of this part of the world. You also see it reflected in, for example, patent filings and other metrics and scientific publications and other metrics of innovation. So another way, a more simple way in which we sometimes describe this is that, look, we look to help be global for China and bring the world to China, but equally we try to be China for global and bring Chinese innovation to the world. Now, whereas there is, in terms of our therapeutic focus, look, whereas there is, a scientific relationship and overlap between neurology and particularly retinal disease, at the same time, we also have to be upfront that our TA focus was also selected, frankly, based on an assessment of unmet need, competitive intensity, availability of opportunity. And in that regard, as you see, in many other parts in the world, whereas there is, an enormous concentration of funds flow and R&D effort going into areas like oncology, you find that when you particularly look into ophthalmology, that there is, enormous unmet need, but much less attention being given to that. So a little over 3 years ago, our principal shareholder, which is a private equity group that I'm happy to give some more background to, called CBC Group, established AffaMed as a platform to really capture those two opportunities, with the key enabler for that being assembling what we think is a world-class development team consisting, of executives who have, not dissimilar to me, but more from a scientific perspective, bring real global experience, mostly US trained, educated, but with strong knowledge of China and the regulatory system, the scientific environment, and leveraging the capabilities of that team, we are now building that portfolio.
Thanks for that candid and comprehensive overview. And I think I love the idea and resonate on global for China and China for global. I think that's incredibly timely and strategic. So, of course, you're on the Ophthalmology Innovation podcast. So maybe we can dig deeper into the ophthalmology pipeline. I mean, when I looked at the AffaMed website, I see that you've got a complete offering, from post-surgical pain through to IOLs and also to the retina, which is, quite a broad pipeline for a early stage company, across ophthalmology. So was that strategy quite intentional? And maybe does it relate to the market needs of China? We'd love to know more about the thinking behind that.
Thank you. It does. As I mentioned earlier, we came at this based on an assessment of need, of opportunity, of competitive intensity, and whereas our ophthalmology portfolio is relatively broad. As of today, we have 11 pharmaceutical and device products in various stages of local development and registration. But when you look at it more closely, you can really group it into two principal buckets. One is a group of products centered around the opportunity, principally in cataract and refractive surgery, both implants, IOLs, but also products to optimize post-surgical care, like our anti-inflammatory compound. And the second bucket is principally focused on retinal disease, with then one additional program in glaucoma added to that. Now, when you look at the underlying opportunities, they're actually very significant. One statistic that, frankly, in a way continues to surprise us is how far behind China, which by all metrics is now a middle income, if not an advanced country in many ways, is still behind in cataract surgery. There is a statistic that I'm sure many of your listeners will be familiar with called the cataract surgery rate, or the CSR. And the CSR in China as of today stands at about 20% of that in the United States, meaning that on a per capita basis, assuming that incidence and prevalence are actually not too dissimilar, 5 times the number of patients would get treated in the US as opposed to China. Even compared to India, which is a country that is obviously less developed, India performs about double the number of cataract surgeries as compared to China on a per capita basis, which is quite a staggering thing. That the Chinese government has recognized this in the sort of healthcare chapter of the current 5-year plan that is being executed. They've actually identified cataract as a principal national health goal that they're putting a lot of support and initiative behind in terms of catching up and bridging that gap. And look, from a numerical perspective, what that means is that whereas last year there were roughly 4 million cataract surgeries performed in China, that number will grow probably to about 10 million by the end of the decade. Which is just the numbers in China are always staggering by any metric, and that's of course in terms of number of surgeries easily the largest opportunity globally, and certainly the largest growth opportunity globally. And what is even more interesting within this regard is that whereas, like in many countries with the single payer system, the public sector is typically very dominant in the provision of care. In China, as it relates to ophthalmology and eye surgery, the private sector actually plays a disproportionately important role. With the existence of large chains of private eye care and surgical hospitals. And what that also frankly means is that from an economic perspective, private pay, self-pay plays a bigger role in eye surgery than in other indications. So it's a very, very important opportunity. And we think that by providing an integrated suite of products, both for use in the surgery itself, as well as for post-surgical care, we develop a play on this very significant growth opportunity. Retinal disease is obviously, a large opportunity in ophthalmology anywhere. I think globally, the anti-VEGF pharmaceutical market will reach, some have estimated it to be as large as $30 billion by the end of this decade. Within China too, we see that anti-VEGF therapies probably represent about a third of the economic opportunity in ophthalmology pharmaceuticals. But again, similar to what you see in surgery, the growth rates far exceed those what you see elsewhere in the world. For the next 5 to 10 years, we estimate that the market for anti-VEGF and just pharmaceuticals for retinal disease will grow at over 20% a year on year, for a significant period of time. That is on a patient base that is probably about 2.5 times the size of that in the United States, and that makes, whereas pricing might still be a bit lower on a unit basis, that will represent a $5 to $7 billion market opportunity within the next 5 to 10 years. So again, a very, very significant opportunity where we think that by offering a portfolio that in our case sort of balances proven therapies with innovation, we can establish ourselves as a leader in that space, particularly given that, to be honest, many of the other local Chinese companies are frankly disproportionately focused on the front of the eye, very heavy in eye drops and perhaps less differentiated products in that regard. So we think there's a unique opportunity to bring innovation into these two principal areas of growth.
Thanks for that overview. And I think, I agree with you, the numbers are staggering, and I'm still astonished by that cataract surgical rate that we see in China. So we talked about the front of the eye, as it were, and you alluded to the sort of retina bucket. Let's maybe talk a bit more about that, because I've been following AffaMed for a little while. It's great to see the press releases that keep coming through. I saw one just, I think, in May of this year regarding the first dosing in the US for one of your assets, AM712. So Firstly, congrats on achieving milestones. It seems like consistently and continuously, but would love to know a bit more about AM712, just at a high level and what you can tell us.
Sure, thank you. And this, first of all, is an illustration of China for Global.
Right.
Earlier, we spoke about, bringing global innovation to Chinese patients. This is an early example of a molecule that we're developing for global markets and hope to monetize there. So AM712 is a molecule that was developed by a laboratory and biotech company based out of California called Asgene. They partnered with us with the idea of us leading global development for the molecule. And we're actually leading in this regard with US development rather than China. Again, illustrating the two directions that we are taking our business. So in AM712, which is the code name that we use within AffaMed, is a fusion protein which inhibits both VEGF and Ang-2. And I should disclaim myself up front. I am not a scientist, as I mentioned earlier.
Doing a great job.
But if you hang around, long enough, you pick up some of the terminology. Now, your listeners and viewers will recognize that this is the pathway that is similar to Roche's faricimab. But I'll underline that this is a different molecule. And the preempting your follow-on questions, which might be, look, how is it different?
That's right.
What I can say is that, look, our thesis behind the product, which is based on preclinical data, which includes data from animal models, is that we believe that this molecule possibly has the potential to more strongly inhibit Ang-2. What that might result in is potentially longer durability and or efficacy, depending on the dosing strategy, compared to faricimab. So our thesis and our hope for the molecule is that this might be a product that by the time it gets to market will be based on a pathway that by then is well understood. Obviously, we are following very closely what look like encouraging signs for adoption of faricimab relative to this current standard of care. And we think that within this pathway, we might have a superior molecule from a clinical perspective. Now, it is still relatively early days. That the press release you referred to was in relation to a first dosing of a patient in a US trial that we're right now conducting. This is a trial, and you can read about it on clinicaltrials.gov, which consists of a dose escalating component followed by a dose expanding component, principally, of course, focused on safety and tolerability, but we also will be looking for efficacy signs. And based on our current trajectory, we hope to be able to share some interim data, not during this year. We've only just commenced the trial, but perhaps by the summer of next year, we hope to have some initial data, and that obviously then will sort of light the way in terms of subsequent development.
Thanks for the great overview there too. And it is wonderful to see the bridging between China and the rest of the world, as you say, and we wish you luck with the continued progress of that program. I want to come back to one of the points you mentioned during that dialogue, where you talked about the language of ophthalmology, because I know you've been in this role since May 2021. Global finance is second nature to you, of course, but maybe the language of ophthalmology is something that is a little more boutique or niche, shall we say. So tell us about the CFO role. How did you adapt to, coming into a smaller company with a kind of very focused mission in early stage biopharma? And what was it like learning the language of ophthalmology? Tell us more about that part of the journey.
Thanks. Look. In fairness, I came to this role after a relatively lengthy career in investment banking covering healthcare companies and biopharma in particular. So that, of course, brought with it, I think, a reasonable degree of familiarity with the business dynamics of companies of this nature. But one thing to give a candid answer is that the honest answer to your question has to be considered within the context of what has happened in the global capital markets, and particularly as they relate to biotech over the past 12 months.
Right, tough times for many people.
When I joined the company, it was, when we were what now in retrospect has turned out to be sort of, the final months of a historic bull run in terms of valuation and capital raising for the sector. And I think the initial premise for me as a CFO was to focus principally on capital raising and of course an IPO, benefiting in particular from the emergence of Hong Kong as what is today the second largest venue for capital raising in the public markets globally, second only to the NASDAQ. But I think my journey, just like the journey of any other CFO in this industry right now, is a journey that is much more focused on, how do you adapt to this far more challenging environment where financing is much less easily available, comes at a higher cost. And I think like all others, we are fortunate in AffaMed that we raised a very large round of financing in the spring of last year. Our most recent fundraise was a Series B, which raised over $170 million of new capital. And that buys us a runway, frankly, to weather this storm. But I think at the same time, one makes investment and capital deployment decisions much more carefully than you might have done in an environment where capital is plentiful and relatively cheap. And I think, from a timing perspective, the path to an IPO, frankly, is more unpredictable as well, which means that, you need to continue to find, alternative ways of growing and building the company, perhaps, accessing sources of capital that are non-dilutive or more patient in that regard. So to be honest, my journey has been, very focused on, on this adaptation. I think, whereas there are perhaps not many benefits to, being sort of experienced and having been around for a while, I think, in this case, having, frankly, being old enough to have seen, the crisis of, 01, 02, the crisis of 08, 09, and this again is that, look, you have a sense that, look, this will pass, and I'm confident that it will, and ultimately you have to focus on building strong fundamentals in the business, because as long as those are in order, you can reasonably expect investors to support you.
And that's really a story of adaptation and resilience, if I may say. I commend you for that. And on the topic of financing, let's maybe touch upon your role as an operating partner at CBC Group. Now, I know in Asia, CBC is a huge deal. It's a very well-known and regarded investment and private equity firm. But for folks who aren't so familiar, maybe give us an overview of CBC and your role within the organization as well.
Sure. So CBC is also still a relatively young fund. It is Asia's principal healthcare specialist investment group. It was created about 8 years ago in China, but is now very much an international investment group. It is headquartered in Singapore, regulated by the monetary authorities there. And what CBC has done over the past couple of years is build a truly multi-asset investment capability, but all centered around the central thesis of growth in healthcare, particularly in Asia, but again, looking to identify opportunities globally where growth in Asia can be leveraged, and the ability to access that growth in Asia can be leveraged to build value in businesses that frankly can be located anywhere in the world. From an investment style perspective, as I mentioned, the fund pursues a range of styles. The principal fund is focused on what you would term sort of buyout or control investment, traditional private equity. But the family of funds includes, more growth and venture-oriented pools of capital. We have a structured credit and royalty fund with a second one soon to be on the way. Interestingly, during the past year, we launched a healthcare real estate oriented fund, which is not just, although it could be sort of hospitals and senior living, but actually in this case is much more focused on the need in particular for manufacturing by that enormous explosion of biotechnology, entrepreneurship and company foundation that is taking place in China right now. There is a lot of science parks that are being developed. All of these need specialist manufacturing capability with all of the unique features that come with that. So the fund is really looking to find ways of building exposure to all of these facets of the sector. Total funds under management now exceed $5 billion. We have offices, of course, in mainland China, our head office in Singapore, but also in London, in New York, in California, in Tokyo, most recently in Korea. So it is becoming quite a broad-based platform, and a lot of fun to be able to. Whereas my principal responsibility is to AffaMed. It's a great opportunity for me to contribute my global experience in this regard as well.
Absolutely. And I think you just mentioned the word fun, which I think is so important, right? When we're experienced leaders in the field, you still got to have fun in what you're doing. And that brings me to my next question. So Vijay, you're a well-regarded leader across investment banking and now in the biotech domain and healthcare more broadly. Tell us a bit more about your leadership style and the culture you're trying to build now, where you're in a relatively smaller organization.
Yeah, I think, look, one thing that banking and biotechnology and life sciences have in common is that you're dealing with organizations that are staffed with, frankly, highly educated, highly knowledgeable professionals. And I think within organizations of that nature, I think the principal responsibility of a leader is to set clear goals and objectives, but then to really empower the teams and really circle them around those goals and offer the independence and responsibility to then achieve those. So I think my style has always been a very trusting style. I don't think a more putting aside that it is not my, it doesn't match my own personality, but I think sort of more authoritative leadership styles, I think, have no place in organizations that are so specialized and qualified as these types of businesses are. So I think from that regard, that's the way I continue to lead in this environment as well. I do think it's important to have the courage to continuously revisit these goals. I think certainly in biotechnology, where at times people can become very attached to a particular scientific thesis, that if that thesis doesn't always quite work out in the clinic, it is not easy to accept that and to move on. And I think it requires courage to continuously reassess whether you're on the right path. And certainly I think what we've experienced in the industry over the last 12 months, this is one of these times where you need to be very honest with yourself, reassess the goals, whether they are rightly matched to either the capabilities of your science or the abilities that the financial markets can afford you to advance that science. So that clearly is important. But to me, it is really about clear goals and empowerment.
I love that way of thinking. And, I was smiling as you were talking about people who become maybe too attached to a clinical program. I think I've been guilty of that too. And it's always really helpful to have that dialogue with, folks in the financial space who can help you to kind of understand the kind of business perspective and to follow the science, but be mindful of business. And so just to round this conversation out, Vijay, you've been a seasoned, shall we say, investor in the space and across healthcare, life sciences, and biotech. You see many trends come and go. Tell me, what do you think of these buzzwords that everyone seems to be using now on social media? So digital, omni-channel, and dare I say the metaverse. So what are your thoughts on these buzzwords? Are they truly the way of the future? And where do you see the future of ophthalmology going?
Yeah, look, I'll try and answer that question without not reverting to those buzzwords too much myself. But look, I think two things that fascinate me about ophthalmology within healthcare and life sciences overall is that, first of all, I think when you look at treatment paradigms and sort of the clinical reality of dealing with eye disease, is that you very quickly find yourself in a multimodal environment where you're dealing not just with pharmaceutical, but with devices, with instruments, with diagnostics that need to be integrated much more strongly, I feel, compared to many other disease areas. Digital clearly is a very powerful enabler, for that integration around a more holistic and dare I say, from a buzzword perspective, patient-centric approach to treatment solutions. But I think ophthalmology offers a sort of an unusually rich opportunity for integrating different approaches. Within China, I commented earlier on the important role, perhaps more so than in other markets in the world, of very strong and well-developed service providers, large chains of eye hospitals who have very significant financial capacity as well. And what is interesting is that in China, we're even seeing the providers come into that mix and playing an active role in supporting product development, clinical development, investing out of venture funds into eye care innovation. So you have an incredibly holistic approach from product to provider, with obviously hopefully the patient at the center of that. I think the second thing that's obviously exciting about eye care is that it's hard to spend time in ophthalmology without feeling that we really do seem to be on the verge of genuine breakthroughs and new treatment paradigms. Whether it is sort of more recently, potential for bispecifics, gene therapy, of course, with all of the cognizance that requires about the many false starts that we've seen over the past 20 odd years, really almost as long as my career has taken place. But I think between those revolutions from a scientific perspective and those revolutions from a treatment perspective, that it is a disease area that offers I think fascinating opportunities for growth in a lot of directions. It can also be, frankly, offers the potential for confusion, as a company. Like, which direction do you go? And look, you see, a device-centric company like an Alcon emphasizing pharmaceuticals more strongly. You see the same happening in other directions. And as I mentioned, in China, we even have providers coming into the mix. So I do think, look, you need to have clarity on what can I really achieve strategically and sort of what is beyond my limits. But it's a richness of choice and opportunity that's really exciting.
Absolutely, it is a richness of choice. And Vijay, thank you so much for sharing those insights and managing not to say the metaverse, although I should say that I would love to meet you in the metaverse, but preferably in real life. So Vijay Karwal, CEO of AffaMed Therapeutics, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the OIS podcast. Tune in next week as we chat science, medicine, and industry with ophthalmology's leading experts. Visit OIS.net for more information on podcasts, events, and exciting new features.